The crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, casting a warm golden glow across the grand salon. Everything in this place screamed luxury and tradition. The walls were covered in deep red velvet, and paintings of famous composers from centuries ago stared down at the crowd below. This was the Vienna Classical Music Hall, one of the most respected places in the entire world of classical music. It was a cold evening in late autumn, and the annual music symposium was in full swing. About 200 people filled the salon, all dressed in expensive suits and elegant gowns. These weren't just random music lovers. These were the people who decided what was good and what wasn't in the classical music world. Critics who could make or break a young musician's career with a single review. Concert hall directors who controlled which artists got to perform on the biggest stages. Music professors from the most elite conservatories in Europe. They stood in small groups holding crystal glasses filled with champagne that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Silver trays floated through the crowd, carried by waiters in white gloves, offering tiny, expensive foods that looked more like art than anything you'd actually want to eat. The conversation buzzed through the room like background music. People talked about the latest performances they'd seen, debated interpretations of famous pieces, and gossiped about which young musicians were worth watching. It was the kind of event where everyone tried to sound smarter than everyone else, where dropping the right name or reference could earn you nods of approval from the right people. In one corner of the salon, near a tall window overlooking the Vienna streets below, a group of particularly important critics had gathered. At the center stood Johann Weber, a man whose reviews in the Vienna Classical Review could launch careers or end them. He was in his 60s with silver hair combed perfectly back and a suit that probably cost more than a small car. When he spoke, people listened. When he had an opinion, it became the opinion that mattered. Tonight, Johann was holding court as usual. Around him stood other influential figures from the European classical music scene. There was Philippe from Paris, Isabella from Milan, and Henrik from Stockholm. These were the gatekeepers, the ones who decided what counted as real classical music culture and what didn't. The conversation had started innocently enough, discussing the state of classical music education around the world, but then someone mentioned an upcoming youth competition that had opened its doors to participants from countries that didn't usually send many competitors. I see we have entries from some rather unexpected places this year, Philippe said, looking at his program with raised eyebrows. Mexico, for instance. When did Mexico start producing classical pianists? A few people chuckled politely. Johann took a sip of his champagne and shook his head slowly, as if the very idea was amusing but also slightly sad. Mexico has no real classical music culture, he said with absolute certainty, the way someone might say the sky is blue or water is wet. It's simply not in their tradition. Classical music requires a certain refinement, a certain cultural foundation that takes centuries to develop. They have their folk music, of course, mariachi bands and such things, but that's not serious music. That's entertainment, Isabella nodded along. It's not about being unkind, she added, as if that made what they were saying better. It's simply a matter of cultural history. The great musical traditions come from Europe. From Germany, Austria, Italy, France, Russia. These are the places where classical music was born and has been nurtured for hundreds of years. You can't just suddenly develop that kind of deep musical culture. Henrik jumped in with his own thoughts. I attended a concert in South America once, he said, waving his hand dismissively. The technical skill was adequate, I suppose, but there was no soul, no real understanding of the European masters. They can copy the notes, but they don't truly understand what Chopin or Mozart were trying to express. That understanding comes from being part of the culture that created this music. More people had drifted over to listen to this conversation. Some nodded in agreement. Others stayed silent but didn't disagree either, which in a way was the same as agreeing. This was how these things worked in their world. The important people stated opinions, and those opinions became accepted truth. Johann continued, warming to his subject now. I'm not saying they shouldn't try, of course. Everyone should have access to music. But let's be realistic about expectations. When we talk about producing true virtuosos, about musicians who can genuinely interpret the great works with authentic understanding, we're talking about a level of cultural sophistication that exists in very specific places. Exactly, Philippe agreed. It's like wine. You can grow grapes anywhere, technically speaking, but the truly great wines come from France and Italy, from regions with centuries of tradition. The same applies to classical music. Mexico might produce competent musicians who can play the notes, but they'll never produce artists who can truly embody the European classical tradition. What none of them seemed to realize or care about was how incredibly insulting their words were. They spoke about an entire country, an entire culture, millions of people, as if they were somehow less capable of creating or understanding beautiful music. They dismissed centuries of Mexican artistic achievement, from indigenous musical traditions to colonial-era compositions to modern Mexican classical composers, as if none of it counted because it wasn't European enough. The sad thing was that this kind of thinking wasn't unusual in their world. Classical music had always had a problem with gatekeeping, with deciding that only certain people from certain places could truly understand and perform it properly. It was wrapped up in old ideas about civilization and culture that should have been left behind decades ago, but somehow still lingered in these fancy concert halls. As the evening went on, the conversation moved to other topics, but the damage was done. Those words hung in the air like smoke. Mexico has no culture. They can't produce real classical musicians. They don't have the sophistication. What Johann and his friends didn't know was that sitting in a small room backstage, just beyond those velvet curtains and golden lights, was someone who was about to prove them spectacularly wrong. Someone small, young, and from the exact place they had just dismissed so casually. Someone who had traveled thousands of miles carrying not just musical talent, but the weight of an entire culture's dignity on her small shoulders. The symposium continued with its champagne and small talk. The critics laughed and debated and congratulated each other on their refined tastes and superior understanding. They had no idea that within just a few hours, everything they thought they knew was about to be challenged by the most unlikely person in the building. And that challenge would come not through arguments or speeches, but through something much more powerful, pure, undeniable, breathtaking music that would leave them with nothing to say except that they had been completely, utterly wrong. Behind the velvet curtains in a small room that served as a waiting area for performers, 8-year-old Sofia Mendez sat on a wooden chair that was too big for her. Her feet dangled several inches off the ground, swinging back and forth nervously. She wore a beautiful dress in deep burgundy, carefully chosen by her mother because it was formal enough for a European concert hall, but not so fancy that it looked like they were trying too hard. But the most special thing about the dress was the hem. If you looked closely, you could see delicate embroidery work running along the bottom, tiny flowers and patterns in bright colors. Her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, had spent weeks working on this embroidery by hand, sewing late into the night after finishing her day job at the local market. Each flower represented something from their neighborhood in Mexico City. Marigolds for the Day of the Dead celebrations, dahlias because they were Mexico's national flower, small cacti because Abuela Rosa said they represented strength and survival in harsh conditions. Sofia's small hands trembled slightly as she looked down at those embroidered flowers. She touched them gently, tracing the patterns with her finger, trying to calm herself down. This wasn't her first performance, not by a long shot. She'd been playing piano since she was 4 years old, ever since her mother had noticed her daughter picking out melodies on an old keyboard by ear. But this was different. This was Vienna. This was Europe. This was the big time. Her mother, Carmen, sat beside her, looking calm on the outside but probably just as nervous on the inside. Carmen was a music teacher at a small school in their neighborhood, the kind of place where they had to share instruments and couldn't afford to fix things when they broke. She'd been saving money for 3 years to make this trip happen. Every extra peso from private lessons, every bit she could squeeze from their budget, went into a jar marked Vienna in their small apartment. The trip had cost almost everything they had. The plane tickets alone had taken a year of savings. Then there was the competition entry fee, accommodation, food, and all the other little expenses that add up when you're traveling to another continent. Carmen's family had helped too. Her brother had contributed what he could. Her sister had organized a small fundraiser in their church. Even neighbors who barely knew them had dropped coins into a collection jar at the local store. Everyone back home was counting on Sofia, not in a pressure way, but in a beautiful, supportive way. The whole neighborhood knew about this trip. Before they left, People had stopped them on the street to wish Sophia good luck. The lady who ran the corner store gave her a small bracelet with a tiny Mexican flag charm. The old man who repaired shoes gave her mother a pair of insoles, for all the walking you'll do in Europe. Their community had wrapped them in love and sent them off with hopes and prayers. Now, sitting backstage in Vienna, Sophia could feel the weight of all those hopes, but there was something else too, something heavier. When they'd arrived at the concert hall earlier that day for registration, she'd noticed the looks. The way some people's eyes had passed over her and her mother, not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of dismissal, like they didn't quite belong here. During the registration process, an assistant had looked at Sophia's name and age on the paperwork and then looked up at her with barely concealed surprise. 8 years old? From Mexico? The woman had said, not unkindly but definitely skeptically. That's quite young. And it's a long way to come. Are you sure she wants to compete? The other children are mostly from established music academies here in Europe. What the woman was really saying, without saying it directly, was, are you sure you want to embarrass yourselves? Are you sure this little girl from Mexico can compete with European-trained musicians? Maybe you should reconsider before you waste everyone's time. Carmen had smiled politely and said yes, they were sure. But Sophia had seen something flash in her mother's eyes, a mixture of hurt and determination. That look said, just you wait and see. Then earlier this evening, something worse had happened. Sophia had been exploring the hallway outside their waiting room, just trying to walk off some of her nervous energy, when she'd passed by a partially open door. Inside was the grand salon where all the important people were gathered. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but she'd heard her country's name and stopped. That's when she heard it. That voice, confident and dismissive, saying those words that would echo in her mind for the rest of her life. Mexico has no real classical music culture. Sophia had stood frozen in that hallway, her heart sinking into her stomach. She'd listened as they laughed, as they agreed with each other, as they dismissed everything she knew and loved about her home. When she'd finally pulled herself away and returned to the waiting room, her mother had immediately noticed something was wrong. Mi amor, what happened? You look upset. Sophia had told her everything. As the words spilled out, tears started rolling down her cheeks. Not angry tears, but hurt tears, the kind that come when someone makes you feel small and unimportant. Carmen had pulled her daughter close, letting her cry for a moment. Then she'd gently lifted Sophia's chin so they were looking at each other eye to eye. Listen to me carefully, Carmen had said softly. Those people don't know what they're talking about. Do you know what I think about when you play piano? Sophia shook her head, wiping her eyes. I think about your great-grandfather who played guitar in a conjunto band and could make people cry with his music. I think about the indigenous peoples who were creating complex musical systems before Europeans even knew our continent existed. I think about Manuel Ponce and Silvestre Revueltas and all the great Mexican composers who created beautiful, sophisticated music that those critics have probably never even heard of. Carmen continued, her voice getting stronger. I think about our mariachi bands, which those people probably dismiss as simple, but which require incredible musical skill and training. I think about the opera houses in Mexico City that have been running since before some European cities even had proper concert halls. I think about the National Symphony Orchestra and all the incredible Mexican musicians who perform around the world. Sophia was listening now, the tears stopping. But most of all, Carmen said, touching the embroidered flowers on Sophia's dress, I think about our family, about Abuela Rosa singing while she cooks, about your Tío Miguel and his guitar at family parties, about the music that fills our streets and our homes and our lives. That's culture, mi amor. Real beautiful living culture. And it's in your blood, in your heart, in your fingers when you play. Carmen smiled. So when you go out on that stage tonight, you're not just playing for yourself. You're playing for all of us, for everyone who's been dismissed and underestimated, and you're going to show them exactly what Mexican culture can do. Sophia took a deep breath. Her mother was right. She thought about her grandfather teaching her folk songs, showing her how music could tell stories. She thought about her aunt who danced ballet folklorico, her elaborate costumes swirling as she moved to traditional music. She thought about the street musicians in their neighborhood, playing with such passion and skill that people would stop in the middle of their busy days just to listen. She thought about her own music teacher back home, who had studied at the conservatory and could play anything but chose to teach kids in their neighborhood because she believed every child deserved access to beautiful music. All of that was culture. All of that was real and valuable and important. The people out there in their fancy clothes with their champagne glasses didn't get to decide what counted as culture and what didn't. Sophia stood up from her chair, straightening her dress and touching the embroidered flowers one more time. She wasn't just an 8-year-old girl anymore. She was a representative. She was carrying her whole country's dignity on her small shoulders, and she was ready to prove everyone wrong, not with words but with music that would speak louder than any argument ever could. The walk from the waiting room to the stage felt like it took forever and no time at all. Sophia followed the stage manager through a narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished wooden floor. She could hear applause from the concert hall as the previous performer finished. The sound was muffled by the heavy curtains, but it still sent a shiver down her spine. The stage manager, a tall woman with kind eyes, looked down at Sophia and gave her an encouraging smile. "First time in Vienna?" she asked in accented English. Sophia nodded, not trusting her voice. "You'll do great," the woman said. "Just remember to breathe." They reached the side of the stage hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains. Through a small gap, Sophia could see the concert hall spreading out before her. It was massive, much bigger than anywhere she'd ever performed. Rows and rows of red velvet seats rose up in tiers, almost all of them filled with people. The walls were decorated with gold trim and more paintings of long-dead composers. The ceiling was painted with elaborate frescoes of angels and clouds, and there, in the center of the stage under a spotlight, sat the piano. It was a gorgeous instrument, a Steinway grand piano that probably cost more than her family's entire apartment building. Its black surface gleamed under the lights like polished glass. Sophia's heart hammered in her chest. She'd practiced on good pianos before, but nothing like this. This was the kind of instrument that professional concert pianists played, the kind that could capture every tiny nuance of touch, every subtle variation in pressure and speed. She heard an announcer's voice boom through the concert hall. "Our next performer is Sofia Mendez, age 8, from Mexico City, Mexico. She will be performing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. There was a moment of silence, and then Sophia heard it. The murmuring. It rippled through the audience like a wave. She couldn't hear the specific words, but she could imagine them. 8 years old? Mexico, really? The stage manager gently touched her shoulder. "You're on. Good luck." Sophia stepped through the curtain. The lights hit her immediately, warm and bright. For a second, she couldn't see anything except the glare. Then her eyes adjusted and she could make out the sea of faces in the audience. Hundreds of people, all looking at her, all waiting, all judging. She walked toward the piano, her legs feeling shaky. The stage felt enormous, like she was crossing a desert. She was very aware of how small she must look out here. A tiny girl in a burgundy dress with embroidered flowers on the hem. She could feel every eye on her. In the 5th row, she could see her mother. Carmen was sitting on the edge of her seat, hands clasped together, smiling encouragement. That helped. Sophia focused on that smile as she walked, but she could also feel the other kinds of looks. The skeptical ones, the dismissive ones. She didn't look at Johann Weber, but she could feel his presence in the room like a cold spot. She knew he was out there somewhere, probably with that same smirk he'd had when talking about Mexican culture earlier. Sophia reached the piano. It towered over her. The piano bench was too high, as she'd expected. A stagehand quickly brought out a special cushion, placing it on the bench so she could sit at the right height. He also adjusted the pedals, attaching extenders so her short legs could reach them properly. This moment was always a bit awkward. Sophia hated it because it drew attention to how young and small she was. She could hear more murmuring from the audience. Some of it might have been sympathetic, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like they were already deciding. She was just a cute little kid who'd probably play a simplified version of the piece and get points for being adorable rather than talented. The stagehand finished with the pedals and quietly left the stage. Sophia was alone now, sitting at the piano with hundreds of pairs of eyes watching her. The silence in the concert hall was complete. She could hear her own breathing, her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She looked down at the piano keys. They were ivory, smooth and perfect. She placed her hands in position, fingers curved, hovering over the keys. This was the moment she'd practiced for thousands of times. Every morning before school, every afternoon after homework, every weekend when her friends were out playing. All those hours had been building to this single moment. But now that she was here, doubt crept back in. What if she made a mistake? What if her fingers slipped? What if she forgot a passage? What if she proved Johann Weber right? Showed everyone that Mexican kids really couldn't measure up to European standards. Her hands trembled slightly. In the audience, she saw someone check their watch. Someone else whispered to their companion. They were getting impatient. They wanted her to start already so they could get this over with and move on to the more serious competitors. Sophia closed her eyes. She thought about what her mother had said. Don't play for them. Play for the music. Play for yourself. She thought about the first time she'd heard this piece, sitting in Senora Martinez's small studio, feeling something shift inside her heart. She thought about her grandfather's guitar music, the way he could make 6 strings speak with more emotion than some people could express in a whole speech. She thought about her grandmother, staying up late to embroider flowers on this dress, each stitch made with love. She thought about her neighborhood, the music that flowed through the streets, the way people's lives were intertwined with rhythm and melody. She thought about Chopin himself, a Polish composer living in France far from his homeland, pouring his longing and love into music. He knew what it felt like to be far from home. He knew what it felt like to express yourself in a place where people didn't quite understand where you came from. Sophia took a deep breath. When she opened her eyes, something had changed. The nervousness was still there, but it was different now. It was energy. It was power. It was readiness. She looked out at the audience one more time, and in that moment, something remarkable happened. Sofia Mendez stopped being a scared 8-year-old girl worried about what people thought. She became a musician. Just a musician, about to share something beautiful with anyone willing to listen. Her fingers touched the keys. The first note of Chopin's Nocturne sang out into the concert hall, pure and clear and absolutely perfect. It hung in the air for a moment like a question being asked. Then the second note joined it, and the third, and suddenly the melody was flowing, delicate and sweet. Sophia's hands moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone so young. Her fingers were small, but they were precise, each note placed exactly where it needed to be. The opening measures of the piece floated through the air like silk ribbons, soft but strong. In the audience, the murmuring stopped immediately. People who had been checking their watches looked up. People who had been whispering fell silent. The skeptical expressions began to change, shifting from dismissive to surprised to something else entirely. Because what was coming from that piano wasn't the work of a cute child playing a piece beyond her years. This was real music. This was artistry. Sophia's face had transformed too. The nervousness was gone, replaced by concentration and something deeper, something that looked almost like joy mixed with sorrow. Her eyes were half closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the music. She wasn't just playing notes on a page anymore. She was telling a story, expressing emotions, creating something that hadn't existed before this moment. The melody built and dipped, whispered and soared. Her left hand maintained the steady accompaniment, while her right hand danced through the intricate melodic lines. The pedaling was perfect, creating just enough resonance without muddying the sound. Every dynamic marking was observed, every phrase shaped with intention. But it wasn't just technical perfection. That would have been impressive enough from an 8-year-old, but this was something more. There was feeling in every note. When the melody climbed to its higher registers, it felt like hope reaching upward. When it descended, it felt like gentle sadness. The ornamental passages weren't just fancy decorations, they were emotional expressions, like someone's voice breaking with feeling. In the 5th row, Carmen had tears streaming down her face. She'd heard Sophia play this piece hundreds of times, but never like this. Never with this level of maturity and understanding. Her daughter wasn't just reproducing music she'd memorized. She was living it, breathing it, making it her own. Further back, in the section where the critics and important people sat, Johann Weber had gone completely still. His smirk was gone. His confident posture had collapsed. He sat forward in his seat, gripping the armrests, staring at the small girl on stage with an expression that mixed shock with something that might have been shame. All around him, other critics and musicians were having similar reactions. The Italian woman who'd agreed that Mexico had no culture was covering her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. The French critic who'd compared classical music to fine wine was shaking his head slowly as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Swedish conductor who'd dismissed South American musicians was leaning forward, completely absorbed. The piece continued, moving into its more complex middle section. This was where many pianists, even skilled ones, could stumble. The passages required perfect coordination between the hands, precise timing, and the ability to bring out the melody even while playing intricate accompaniment patterns. The music swelled and dipped like ocean waves, each phrase rising to meet the next in a continuous flow of melody. Sophia's interpretation wasn't rushed or mechanical. She gave each note the space it needed to breathe, to resonate, to mean something. This was what separated good musicians from great ones. Anyone could learn to hit the right notes at the right time. But making those notes speak, making them carry emotion from the performer's heart to the listener's, that was Art Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Was a piece about longing, about beauty tinged with sadness, about remembering something precious that might be lost. Different pianists interpreted it in different ways. Some played it with technical brilliance but emotional coldness. Others played it with so much sentimentality that it became syrupy and fake. The best interpretations found the balance, honoring both the complexity of the composition and the genuine feeling it was meant to express. Sophia had found that balance. At 8 years old, sitting on a cushion so she could reach the pedals, thousands of miles from home, she had found it. Her fingers moved through the intricate passages with absolute confidence now. The nervousness from before had burned away completely, replaced by pure musical communication. When the melody climbed into the upper registers, her touch became lighter, more delicate, letting those high notes sparkle like stars. When it descended into the lower ranges, she added weight and depth, making the piano sing with a richer, more resonant tone. The middle section of the piece grew more complex, with running passages in the right hand that required perfect evenness and control. Sophia's fingers danced across the keys, each note crystal clear and perfectly timed. Her left hand maintained the gentle rocking rhythm of the accompaniment, never overpowering the melody but always supporting it, like a heartbeat underlying everything else. In the audience, people were experiencing something they hadn't expected. This wasn't just a good performance. This was the kind of performance that reminded you why you loved music in the first place. The kind that made you forget where you were and who you were and just exist in the moment. Being carried along by pure sound. An elderly gentleman in the third row, a retired concert pianist who'd performed in this very hall 40 years ago, felt tears forming in his eyes. He'd heard this piece played by some of the greatest pianists in the world. He'd played it himself countless times, but there was something about hearing it now, played by this child who somehow understood it so deeply, that broke through his professional detachment and touched something raw in his heart. A young student from the Vienna Conservatory, sitting in the balcony with other students, leaned over to her friend and whispered, "She's 8. How is this possible?" Her friend couldn't answer. She just shook her head, equally amazed. A music journalist who'd been sent to cover the competition and had expected to write a standard review about promising young talent was frantically rewriting his mental notes. This wasn't going to be a standard review. This was going to be a story about something extraordinary. But the most profound reactions were happening in the section where Johann Weber and his fellow critics sat. These were people who'd spent decades evaluating performances, who'd heard the world's greatest musicians, who prided themselves on their sophisticated and discerning taste. They weren't supposed to be surprised anymore. They weren't supposed to be moved by anything except the very finest artistry, and yet here they were, completely transfixed by a child they'd dismissed without hearing a single note. Johann Weber's hands were trembling. He'd clutched the armrests of his seat so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His mind was reeling. Everything he'd said earlier that evening, every confident proclamation about Mexican culture and classical music, was being systematically demolished by what he was hearing. And the worst part was that he couldn't deny it. He couldn't claim this was just technical skill or youthful energy. This was genuine musical understanding, the kind that supposedly took decades to develop. The woman from Italy, Isabella, had given up trying to maintain her sophisticated composure. Tears were running down her carefully made-up face, smearing her mascara. She didn't care. She was too absorbed in the music to worry about her appearance. Philippe from Paris had his eyes closed, completely lost in the sound. He'd forgotten about his earlier comments comparing classical music to fine wine. He'd forgotten about his certainty that true artistry only came from European cultural traditions. Right now, he was just a person listening to beautiful music, and it was breaking his heart in the best possible way. The piece was building toward its emotional climax now. This was the section that always got to Sophia when she practiced at home. The melody reached its highest point, suspended there for a moment like someone crying out in joy or pain or both, and then began its gentle descent, resolved but touched with sadness. Sophia felt everything she'd ever felt pouring into these notes. The love she had for her family, the pride she felt in her culture, the hurt from hearing those dismissive words earlier, the determination to prove them wrong, the pure joy of playing music she loved. It all mixed together and flowed out through her fingers onto those keys. Her body moved with the music now, swaying gently, her face expressing every shift in emotion. When the melody soared, she lifted slightly from the bench. When it quieted, she seemed to curl inward. She was completely unself-conscious, completely unaware of being watched by hundreds of people. There was only the music. The technical demands of the piece never let up. Even in the emotional high points, Chopin had written difficult passages that required perfect control. There were places where the melody in the right hand had to be brought out clearly, while the same hand was also playing accompaniment notes. There were jumps that required precision and confidence. There were dynamic shadings that needed to be executed perfectly to maintain the emotional arc of the piece. Sophia handled all of it with a mastery that seemed impossible for her age. Her small hands moved with absolute certainty. Every jump landed exactly on the right notes. Every phrase was shaped with intention. The soft passages were genuinely soft, almost whisper quiet, but never lost their intensity. The louder sections had power without harshness, and the pedaling, something that many young pianists struggled with, was absolutely perfect. Sophia knew exactly when to press the pedal to add resonance and when to release it to keep the sound clean. The result was a gorgeous wash of harmony that enhanced the melody without muddying it. As the piece moved into its final section, Sophia's playing took on an even deeper quality. This was the part where the melody returned but transformed, tinged with the knowledge of everything that had come before. It was the same theme from the opening, but it meant something different now. It was acceptance, maybe, or wisdom gained through experience, or the bittersweet recognition that beautiful things are also fragile and temporary. Sophia played these final phrases with a tenderness that seemed far beyond her years. How could an 8-year-old understand these complex emotions? How could she express them so perfectly? The audience didn't know, couldn't explain it, but they could feel it. It was real. It was true. The melody wound down, becoming softer and softer. Sophia's touch became incredibly delicate, barely caressing the keys now. The notes fell like gentle rain, each one precious. The piece was ending, preparing for its final resolution. And then came the last few measures. The melody settled on its final notes, that familiar E-flat major harmony that brings the piece home. Sophia played them with exquisite care, letting them resonate fully before adding the very last, soft chord. She held her hands on the keys for a moment after that final chord, letting the sound fade naturally, not rushing to break the spell. The piano's resonance filled the concert hall, gradually diminishing, softer and softer, until finally it disappeared into silence. Sophia lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. She opened her eyes as if waking from a dream. The trance of performance lifted and she became aware again of where she was. The bright lights, the enormous concert hall, the hundreds of people watching her. For a moment there was absolute silence. Not a single person moved. Not a program rustled, not a chair creaked. The entire audience seemed frozen, caught in the space between the end of the music and the return to normal reality. Sophia sat very still, suddenly afraid. Had she made a mistake? Had she played badly? Why wasn't anyone reacting? The silence stretched on, second after second, and her heart began to sink. She looked out toward where her mother was sitting, trying to find that familiar face in the crowd, trying to understand what was happening. Had she disappointed everyone? Had she proven Johann Weber right after all? Then from somewhere in the middle of the hall, a single pair of hands began to clap. Just one person breaking the silence with slow, deliberate applause. A second person joined in, then a third. Then suddenly, like a dam breaking, the entire concert hall erupted. People leaped to their feet. The applause was thunderous, overwhelming, shaking the very walls of the ancient building. It wasn't polite, appreciative applause. This was something else entirely. This was the sound of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary, something they knew they would remember for the rest of their lives. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Sophia stood on the stage, overwhelmed by the response, not quite knowing what to do with her hands or where to look. She bowed again, a little more confidently this time, and the audience responded with another surge of cheering and clapping. Finally, the stage manager appeared from the wings, gently guiding Sophia off the stage so the next performer could prepare. But even as Sophia walked back through the curtains, she could still hear the applause echoing behind her. It was slowly fading, but it had lasted much longer than for any of the previous performers that evening. Backstage, Carmen was waiting for her, having rushed from her seat the moment Sophia left the stage. She swept her daughter into her arms, holding her tight, both of them crying now. Happy tears, relieved tears, proud tears all mixed together. Mi amor, mi amor. Carmen kept saying, kissing the top of Sophia's head. You were magnificent. You were perfect. I'm so proud of you. Sophia buried her face in her mother's shoulder, finally letting all the tension of the past hours drain away. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. The relief was almost as overwhelming as the performance itself had been. Other people started appearing backstage to congratulate her. The elderly pianist who'd been sitting in the third row found his way back and took Sophia's small hand in both of his. Young lady, he said in heavily accented English, his voice shaking with emotion. I have been attending concerts in this hall for 50 years. I have heard the greatest pianists of our time. What you did tonight was something special. Something truly special. Don't ever let anyone tell you different. A group of conservatory students crowded around asking questions, wanting to know where she studied, who her teacher was, how long she'd been playing. They treated her like a colleague, not like a little kid, and that felt wonderful. But in the concert hall itself, the atmosphere was complicated. The competition had to continue, of course. There were still several more young performers waiting for their turns, but something fundamental had shifted in the room. Everyone was still thinking about what they'd just heard. The next few performers, talented as they were, seemed to struggle under the weight of following Sophia's performance. In the critics section, the mood was especially heavy. Johann Weber sat motionless in his seat long after most people had settled back down. He stared at the stage where the next performer was playing, but he wasn't really seeing or hearing anything. His mind was replaying Sophia's performance note by note, phrase by phrase. And with each replay he felt worse. He'd been so certain, so absolutely confident in his pronouncements about Mexico and culture and classical music. He'd spoken with the authority of someone who knew he was right, who'd never even considered that he might be wrong. And in front of all his colleagues in his own concert hall, he'd been proven spectacularly, undeniably wrong by an 8-year-old child. The shame burned in his chest. It wasn't just that he'd been wrong about Sophia's talent. That would have been embarrassing enough. But he'd been wrong about something much bigger. He'd dismissed an entire country, an entire culture, millions of people, based on his own prejudices and limited perspective, and he'd done it casually, carelessly, as if it was just a matter of obvious fact rather than offensive ignorance. How many other things had he been wrong about? How many talented musicians had he overlooked or dismissed because they came from the wrong places? How many opportunities had been denied to people because of the gatekeeping attitudes of people like him? Isabella, sitting next to him, wasn't in much better shape. She'd stopped bothering to wipe away her tears. Her mascara was ruined anyway. She kept thinking about what she'd said earlier about cultural sophistication, about how certain regions just didn't have the history or refinement to produce great classical musicians. What Sophia had played wasn't just technically proficient. It had been deeply sophisticated, full of nuance and emotional intelligence that supposedly took a lifetime of cultural immersion to develop. Where had that sophistication come from? From Mexico City, from a regular neighborhood, from a family that had to save for years just to afford the trip to Vienna. Philippe from Paris was in his own private crisis. He'd made that comparison to wine, had insisted that greatness only came from certain established regions with centuries of tradition, but what he'd just heard challenged everything he thought he understood about tradition and culture. Maybe, he was starting to realize, tradition wasn't about geographic location at all. Maybe it was about love and dedication, and the passing down of knowledge from one generation to the next. Maybe it happened in small studios in Mexico City, just as much as in prestigious European conservatories. Maybe, just maybe, he'd been looking at the whole thing wrong his entire career. Henrik from Stockholm sat with his head in his hands. He'd been the one who said South American musicians could copy the notes but never truly understand the European masters. What a ridiculous, arrogant thing to say. Sophia hadn't just understood Chopin. She'd understood him deeply, intimately, in a way that transcended geography and nationality. Her interpretation had been unique yet respectful, personal yet true to the composer's intentions. Around them, other audience members were having their own reckonings, though perhaps less intense. Many had come in with low expectations based on Sophia's age and background. They'd expected to be politely impressed maybe, but not genuinely moved. The gap between their expectations and reality had left them shaken and reflective. A music journalist furiously scribbled notes, trying to capture what had just happened. He knew this was a story, a real story, not just another review of a youth competition. He was already thinking about angles, about how to convey not just the quality of the performance but its significance, its impact on the assumptions and prejudices of the classical music world. When the intermission came, the lobby was buzzing with conversation. Everyone was talking about Sophia. Her performance had overshadowed everything else, had become the only thing that mattered about this entire event. Did you see her face when she played? Those hands, so small but such control. I've never heard that piece played with such maturity. Where did she say she was from again? Mexico City? We need to pay more attention to what's happening there. 8 years old. I still can't believe it. But the most important conversations were happening in quieter corners, away from the excited chatter of the main crowd. Johann Weber had found his way to a small side room, needing space to think. Philippe and Isabella had followed him along with Henrik. The four of them stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, Johann spoke. I need to apologize to that child and her mother. We all do, Isabella said quietly. What we said earlier, it was disgraceful. It was worse than disgraceful, Philippe added. It was ignorant and hurtful, and we said it so casually, so confidently, like we had the right to dismiss an entire culture. Henrik nodded. I've been reviewing performances for 30 years. I thought I knew something about music and talent. But tonight I realized how much my own biases have been clouding my judgment. How many talented musicians have I overlooked because they didn't fit my narrow idea of what a classical musician should be? Johann straightened his shoulders. I'm going to find them after the competition ends. I'm going to apologize properly, not with excuses or qualifications. I'm going to tell them they were right and I was wrong. That won't be enough, though, Isabella said. An apology is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need to think about how we change things going forward, how we open doors instead of closing them, how we look for talent in places we've been ignoring. The four of them stood together, united now not by their earlier arrogance but by their shared recognition of how wrong they'd been. It was uncomfortable and humbling, but it was also necessary. Sometimes you need to be proven wrong, spectacularly and undeniably, before you can start to see clearly. Back in the concert hall, the competition continued. More young musicians performed, some brilliantly. But everyone knew, even before the judges had deliberated, that something historic had happened tonight. Sofia Mendes had walked onto that stage carrying the weight of her country's dignity, and she delivered a performance that no one in that hall would ever forget. The judges had a difficult task ahead of them. Technically speaking, they had to evaluate all the performances and choose a winner, based on musical merit. But how do you judge a performance that transcended mere technical achievement? How do you score something that had moved an entire concert hall to tears, that had challenged assumptions and changed minds? The answer, they were beginning to realize, was that some performances are beyond scoring. Some moments in music history are so special that trying to quantify them misses the point entirely. This had been one of those moments. In a small room backstage, Sophia sat with her mother, sipping water and slowly coming down from the emotional high of performance. She still couldn't quite process what had happened. The applause had been incredible, overwhelming. But what meant more to her was that she'd played the way she wanted to play. She'd connected with the music, had said what she needed to say through those notes. Are you okay? Carmen asked, studying her daughter's face. Sophia nodded. I think so. That was scary but also amazing. The morning after the performance, Vienna woke up to unexpected news. The story of Sophia's performance had spread overnight, first through the classical music community's tight networks of gossip and professional connections, then through social media, and finally into mainstream news outlets. A video recording of her performance, taken by one of the competition organizers, had been shared online and was going viral. Within hours, it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Comments flooded in from around the world, from professional musicians, music students, casual listeners, and people who didn't normally care about classical music at all. "This made me cry, and I don't even like classical music," one comment. "At 8 years old, I can't even comprehend this level of talent," said another. "As a Mexican, I'm so proud right now. This little girl just represented our country on the world stage." But it wasn't just online buzz. The music journalist who'd been at the performance had worked through the night to write his article, and it was published in a major European newspaper that morning. The headline read, "8-year-old Mexican pianist delivers performance for the ages, challenges classical music's cultural assumptions." The article didn't just review Sophia's performance, it contextualized it, talking about the classical music world's tendency to overlook talent from certain regions, about the assumptions and prejudices that still lingered in supposedly sophisticated artistic circles. It quoted Johann Weber's dismissive comments from before the performance and his tearful apology afterward. It was the kind of article that sparked conversation and debate, that made people uncomfortable in necessary ways. By mid-morning, other media outlets were picking up the story. Radio stations played recordings of the performance. Television news programs featured segments about the Mexican piano prodigy who stunned Vienna. The story had everything that made for compelling news: a young underdog, stunning talent, a challenge to established prejudices, and a powerful emotional moment. Sophia and Carmen woke up in their small hotel room to find Carmen's phone buzzing constantly with messages from back home. Friends, family, neighbors, even people they barely knew were reaching out with congratulations and excitement. The video had made its way to Mexico, and the response there was overwhelming. "You need to see this," Carmen said, showing Sophia her phone. There were messages from Abuela Rosa, from Senora Martinez, from Sophia's uncle and aunt. But there were also messages from people they didn't know. The local news in Mexico City had picked up the story. Their neighborhood was celebrating. Someone had even hung a banner outside their apartment building. "Congratulations, Sophia. You made us proud." Sophia looked at the photos and messages, feeling overwhelmed all over again. She'd known her performance mattered, but she hadn't quite realized how far-reaching the impact would be. There was a knock at their hotel room door. When Carmen opened it, they found a representative from the competition standing there with an enormous bouquet of flowers and a formal envelope. "Good morning," the woman said with a warm smile. "These are for Sophia from the competition committee. And this," she held up the envelope, "is an official invitation to perform at the Vienna Classical Music Festival next summer. They want Sophia to be one of the featured performers." Carmen took the envelope with shaking hands. "Featured performer? But that's for established artists, isn't it?" "Usually, yes," the woman agreed. "But after last night, the festival director feels that Sophia deserves a place on that stage. They're also offering to cover all expenses for you both to return to Vienna." After the woman left, Carmen and Sophia sat on the hotel bed, looking at the invitation in disbelief. Sophia was being invited to perform at one of Europe's most prestigious music festivals, an event that drew audiences from around the world. "This is happening so fast," Carmen said, half laughing, half crying. "Yesterday you were a nervous little girl worried about what people would think. Today you're being invited to major festivals." But the recognition went beyond just performance opportunities. Throughout the day, other invitations and offers started coming in. A prestigious music conservatory in Vienna reached out, offering Sophia a full scholarship if her family ever decided to relocate to Europe. A recording company expressed interest in producing an album. Various concert halls across Europe sent inquiries about booking her for performances. More importantly, though, the conversations Sophia's performance had sparked were continuing. In classical music circles across Europe, people were discussing the assumptions and biases that had been exposed. Online forums and social media platforms were filled with debates about cultural gatekeeping in classical music. Many musicians from Latin America, Asia, Africa, and other regions often overlooked by the classical music establishment shared their own stories of being dismissed or underestimated. They talked about the extra hurdles they faced, the way their talent was always questioned more rigorously than that of musicians from traditional classical music countries. "I've been dealing with this my entire career," wrote a pianist from Brazil. "No matter how well I play, there's always this subtle suggestion that I'm somehow less authentic, less legitimate than European musicians. Maybe now people will start to recognize how harmful these attitudes are." A conductor from South Korea shared her experience of constantly having to prove herself in ways her European colleagues never did. "I'm always the talented Asian conductor or the promising musician from Korea. Never just a conductor, never just a musician. My geographic origin is always mentioned as if it's surprising that someone like me can understand Beethoven or Mozart." The conversation was uncomfortable for many people in the classical music world. It forced them to confront biases they might not have even realized they held. But it was also necessary. Sophia's performance had opened a door, had created a moment where these important discussions could happen. Back at the Vienna Concert Hall, the competition had concluded with Sophia being awarded the first prize, along with several special commendations for artistic excellence. But the real impact of the event was playing out in conversations happening in conservatory hallways, in critics' offices, in the homes of music teachers and performers around the world. Johann Weber, true to his word, had written a public statement that was published in several classical music journals. In it, he openly admitted his prejudiced comments and apologized not just to Sophia and her family, but to all the musicians and communities his attitudes had dismissed over the years. "I have spent my career believing that I understood what makes great music," he wrote. "I thought sophistication and cultural depth could only come from certain places, certain traditions. I was wrong. Sofia Mendes showed me that artistry transcends geography, that musical understanding is not the property of any single culture or region. I apologize for my ignorance, and I commit to using my platform going forward to amplify voices from all corners of the world." It was a remarkable statement, one that took real courage to make. Some of Weber's colleagues praised him for his honesty and growth. Others criticized him, saying his apology didn't undo the damage caused by years of gatekeeping. Both responses were valid. The classical music world was beginning a long overdue process of self-examination. Major orchestras and opera companies started reviewing their hiring and programming practices. Were they truly looking for the best talent? Or were they unconsciously favoring certain backgrounds? Music competitions began actively recruiting participants from regions they'd previously overlooked. Conservatories started establishing partnerships with music schools in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. It wasn't a complete transformation, of course. Systemic biases built over centuries don't disappear overnight. But Sophia's performance had created a crack in the wall, had made people aware of problems many had never acknowledged before. That was the first necessary step toward real change. Meanwhile, Sophia and Carmen were dealing with their own complicated feelings about all the attention. The recognition was wonderful, validating, exciting, but it was also a lot of pressure. Sophia was still just 8 years old. She still had homework to do and friends to play with and a childhood to live. Carmen was particularly concerned about protecting her daughter from being overwhelmed. She'd seen child prodigies burned out by too much too soon, pushed by ambitious parents or demanding schedules until they lost their love for music. She was determined that wouldn't happen to Sophia. "We need to be smart about this," Carmen told her daughter as they sat together in their hotel room, sorting through the various invitations and offers. "Yes, these opportunities are amazing. But you're still a kid. You still need time to just be 8 years old, to play with friends, to learn and grow at your own pace." Sophia nodded, feeling relieved. Part of her was excited about all the attention and opportunities, but another part of her just wanted to go home, to her own bed, to her normal life. They spent the afternoon composing responses to the various invitations. They accepted the festival invitation for the following summer, giving them plenty of time to prepare. They politely declined the conservatory scholarship, explaining that Sophia wanted to continue her education in Mexico. They expressed interest in the recording opportunity, but said they'd need time to think about it. The plane ride back to Mexico felt completely different from the journey to Vienna. On the way there, Sophia and Carmen had been nervous, uncertain, hoping but not quite daring to expect too much. On the way home, they carried with them the first-place trophy, countless memories, new connections, and a profound sense of achievement that went far beyond winning a competition. When they landed in Mexico City, they were surprised to find a small crowd waiting at the airport. Word had spread about their arrival time and people had come out to welcome them home. There were neighbors from their building, friends from Sofia's school, members of their church community, and even some local news reporters. Abuela Rosa pushed through the crowd first, wrapping Sofia in a hug so tight the little girl could barely breathe. Mi niña preciosa, she kept saying. My precious girl, you made us all so proud. The next few days were a whirlwind of local attention. The neighborhood threw an impromptu celebration, with families bringing food and drinks, someone setting up speakers to play music, and children running around while adults talked and laughed. Sofia found herself retelling the story of her performance over and over, each time remembering new details, feeling again the rush of nerves and triumph. The local news interviewed her and Carmen, wanting to know about their experience in Vienna. Sofia talked about the beautiful concert hall, the moment of hearing those dismissive comments, and the feeling of proving people wrong through music rather than words. What do you want people to know about Mexico? The reporter asked. Sofia thought for a moment. I want them to know we have culture. Real culture. My grandmother sews beautiful things. My teacher plays piano better than lots of people in Europe. The street musicians in our neighborhood make people stop and listen. We have great composers and artists and musicians. We always have. People just need to pay attention. The interview aired on national television and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from across Mexico, from people who'd felt seen and validated by Sofia's story, from musicians who'd faced similar dismissals, from parents who wanted their children to know that talent and dedication mattered more than background or geography. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from her own community. The school Sofia attended organized a special assembly where she performed for her classmates. These were the kids she'd grown up with, who'd thought she was a bit weird for spending so much time practicing piano. Now they looked at her with new eyes, with pride and excitement. After her performance at the school, several children approached their parents asking about music lessons. The local music school where Senora Martinez taught saw a surge in enrollment. Sofia had inspired her community, had shown them that big dreams were possible even from their small neighborhood. Senora Martinez was particularly moved by this development. This is what I've always believed, she told Carmen one afternoon at a lesson, that every child deserves access to music, that talent exists everywhere if we just give people the opportunity to develop it. Sofia proved that to the world, but more importantly, she proved it to our own community. The months that followed brought continued opportunities and growth. Sofia received invitations to perform at various venues across Mexico. She played at the National Palace, at prestigious concert halls in Guadalajara and Monterrey, at cultural centers and universities. Each performance drew large, enthusiastic crowds, many of whom had never attended a classical music concert before but came because they'd heard Sofia's story and wanted to support her. But Carmen was careful to balance these opportunities with normal childhood activities. Sofia still went to school every day. She still did her homework at the kitchen table. She still played with friends in the neighborhood park. Yes, she practiced piano several hours a day, but that was because she loved it, not because she was being pushed. The summer arrived, and with it came the return trip to Vienna for the Classical Music Festival. This time the experience was different. Sofia wasn't an unknown 8-year-old anymore. She was an invited featured performer, someone the festival was proud to host. The organizers treated her and Carmen like honored guests, providing better accommodations and ensuring they felt welcome and comfortable. The performance at the festival was even more powerful than the competition had been. Sofia played several pieces this time, including works by Mexican composers Manuel Ponce and Silvestre Revueltas, alongside the European classical repertoire. This was intentional. She wanted to introduce the European audience to the beauty and sophistication of Mexican classical music, to show them what they'd been missing by dismissing her country's musical traditions. The audience's response was rapturous. People who'd come expecting to hear a talented child ended up discovering a mature artist and a whole musical tradition they'd been ignorant of. After the performance, during the reception, Dozens of people asked where they could find recordings of Mexican classical composers. Several music programmers made notes to include more Latin American works in their upcoming seasons. Johann Weber attended the performance, and afterward, he approached Sophia and Carmen again. Over the past year, he'd undergone a genuine transformation. He'd started actively seeking out and promoting musicians from underrepresented regions. He'd used his platform to write about the biases in classical music and the need for greater inclusivity. "Sophia," he said, "I want you to know that your performance last year changed my life. I've spent this year trying to make amends for decades of narrow-minded thinking. I'm not perfect yet, but I'm learning, and it's largely because of you." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a letter of recommendation he'd written, describing her as one of the finest young pianists he'd encountered in his entire career, regardless of age or background. "You might need this someday," he said, "for applications or opportunities. I wanted you to have it." As Sophia grew older, the impact of that first Vienna performance continued to ripple outward. She became a symbol, yes, but she also remained a person, a kid who loved music and happened to be very good at it. She continued to study with Senora Martinez, refusing offers from famous teachers in Europe and the United States. She wanted to stay rooted in her community, to prove that you didn't have to leave home to achieve excellence. By the time she turned 12, Sophia had performed in concert halls across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. But she still lived in the same apartment in Mexico City. She still practiced on the same piano her mother had bought years ago. She still ate at the same corner taco stand and played in the same neighborhood park. Her success had opened doors for other young Mexican musicians. The classical music world was paying more attention to Latin America now, actively recruiting talented young people who might have been overlooked before. Several musicians who'd been struggling to get recognition suddenly found opportunities opening up. They often credited Sophia's Vienna performance with changing the conversation, with making it impossible for people to dismiss their talent based on geography. Music schools in Mexico saw increased funding and support. International partnerships developed. Young musicians who might have thought classical music wasn't for them, that it was something foreign and inaccessible, now saw it as something they could claim as their own. Sophia received letters from young musicians around the world, especially from places that had been marginalized by the classical music establishment. Kids from Brazil, from South Africa, from the Philippines, from India, all writing to say that her story had inspired them to pursue their musical dreams despite the obstacles. One letter particularly touched her. It was from a 10-year-old girl in Morocco who wrote, "I always loved classical music, but my teachers said it wasn't really for people like us. Then I saw your video and I realized they were wrong. If you can play Chopin in Vienna and make everyone listen, then I can play too. Thank you for showing me that." These letters reminded Sophia of why that first performance had mattered so much. It wasn't just about her personal achievement. It was about representation, about challenging the gatekeepers, about proving that art and beauty and excellence belong to everyone, not just to people from certain backgrounds or places. As she entered her teenage years, Sophia's playing continued to mature and deepen. She developed her own artistic voice, her own interpretations that honored the composers while bringing something unique and personal to each piece. Critics who'd once been skeptical now praised her unreservedly. She was no longer the talented child from Mexico, but simply one of the finest young pianists in the world, period. But Sophia never forgot where she came from. She gave free concerts in her old neighborhood regularly. She established a scholarship fund to help young musicians from low-income families afford lessons and instruments. She spoke openly about the importance of music education for all children, not just the privileged few. When she was 15, a major documentary was made about her life and career. The film spent considerable time on that first Vienna performance, interviewing the people who'd been there, including Johann Weber and the other critics who'd dismissed Mexican culture. Their honest discussion of their own prejudices and the way Sophia's performance had changed their thinking became one of the most powerful parts of the documentary.